So welcome, thank you for joining today. The topic is the potential for hydrogen in the UK transport sector. And this webinar is a collaboration between BIP, which is a consultancy, and National Gas Transmission. So the presenters for today are myself, Isabel Ray, Francesca Baiocchi, and Giulio Formicola. And we also have Helen Dugdale from National Gas Transmission, who'll be talking towards the end about the UK transmission network. So we'll just start off with a few logistics before diving into the content. So we're really keen to get your views during a session. So please do use the Teams chat to post your comments and questions. You'll see you're muted, you're not able to speak, but please do use the chat to, take part in the discussion. During a session, we'll try and respond to the questions where we can, rather than having a formal question and answer at the end. We'll also be using Mentimeter to run a few polls at the beginning and end, just to ask a few questions and get your views. So it'd be great if you'd like to join in with that. So if you look in the chat, you should see the details of Mentimeter. If you haven't used it before, you can join it on your mobile or on your laptop using a QR code or the email address website. And finally, after the session, we'll share three things with you. So we'll share a copy of the slides, the report. You'll have a link to the recording and also question and answer document, particularly if you get questions we're not able to cover in the session. Okay, so why are we here today, especially for some of us on a lovely sunny day? So the UK transport sector needs to undergo a huge transformation if it is to move away from its reliance on fossil fuels. Now, there's increasing interest in using hydrogen across a range of sectors, including transport. But there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of the scope, where will hydrogen be used, the timelines, and the cost. Now, the UK government has identified hydrogen as fundamental to achieving net zero in the transport industry. So we've just completed a 6-month research project looking at the demand for hydrogen in transport. And today we'd like to share with you some of our analysis and our views. We're also keen to get your views as well. Now, this work is linked with Project Union, where National Gas Transmission is looking at how it can repurpose the UK gas transmission pipelines to transport hydrogen instead of natural gas. Okay, so what we'd like to do now is just get your views with 3 simple questions. So if you are able to access Mentimeter and you'd like to join, then that's great. If not, you can just watch and see the results come through. But as mentioned earlier, these details should also be in the chat. So if we switch to the Mentimeter screen, we can look at the questions. Okay, so first question, we'd like to know just a little bit around you. So what is your in what sector is your job or main expertise? And sorry if your sector is not on here. Good, quite interesting. A few people taking part. Okay, so interesting. So we've got quite a few from the energy sector, which makes sense given the focus on hydrogen, and a few from rail and automotive shipping, and a few from other sectors. Thank you. Okay, let's move to the next question. Are you currently involved in hydrogen in your work? And there's no right answer, we're just interested. Okay, so for those that answered yes, looks like we've got a few hydrogen experts in the audience. So please do add your views in the Teams chat as we go through if you have views on particular topics. And for those of you that are new to hydrogen, it's great to have you here. So please do ask questions, particularly if things are unclear or, we're using acronyms or terminology that you're not familiar with. Okay, last question in this section. What is your view on the potential for using hydrogen to power transport in the UK? Okay, interesting how it moves around. So I think, still moving. So I guess the majority could have potential, which is fair enough, given there's obviously a lot of uncertainty around, which we'll discuss today. And some people are very positive, strong advocates who see the opportunity. But I guess the question there is, how do we achieve this hydrogen industry? How do we make the investment? How do we scale up? And it looks like there's lots of positive views. So it'll be interesting to see at the end of the session if any of those views have changed. So thank you for taking part. We'll ask a couple more questions at the end. So if we switch back to the slides, thank you. Okay, so agenda for today. So I will start off providing a bit of framing and background on the transport sector, particularly for those of you who maybe work in the energy industry and are less familiar with it. Francesca will then present the results of our analysis on the potential for hydrogen. And Julia and Helen will then provide a regional perspective, because the impact will be different in different parts of the UK. And they'll also look briefly at the requirements for infrastructure. So let's kick off. So the UK, as most of you know, was the first country to implement a legally binding target to reach net zero in 2050. This chart shows greenhouse gas emissions in the UK over time, split by different sectors from 1990 to 2021. So I guess the first thing that strikes you is this is a really positive picture, given that over this period, greenhouse gas emissions have declined by 47%. Now, this has mainly been driven by the phase out of coal-fired power generation. In terms of transport, which is our focus for today, that's the dark blue part in the middle of the chart. So in the latest data here, 2021, transport made up about 25% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. So that's actually the largest proportion. So clearly, if the UK wants to achieve its target of reaching net zero, we have to transform the transportation sector. And how do we do that? So when we talk about transport, we're talking about moving both people and freight, so goods, both around the UK and also in and out of the UK. Typically, we split transport into 4 modes. So that's road, rail, aviation and shipping. And obviously within road, there's lots of different vehicle types. So cars, vans, lorries, buses, coaches, etc. So this chart shows the annual carbon dioxide emissions from the transport sector. So what's interesting is emissions have remained roughly constant, haven't really changed much, other than the impact of COVID, which we see in 2020 onwards. And clearly that was down to all lockdown restrictions. So the interesting question is, will emissions and use of transport go back to where it was pre-COVID? The answer, I guess, is probably yes and no. Clearly, there's now different working patterns. I mean, a lot of you today are probably working from home. Maybe that was different to the past. So we haven't yet seen transport levels and emissions get quite back to where they were in 2019. So our question is, how do we decarbonise the transport sector and reduce CO2 emissions? So in simple ways, there's 3 levers to do this. So we could reduce the amount of travel or shift how we travel. But this is quite hard to do. Demand for travel is very strongly correlated to GDP, so gross domestic product, and demographics. And in reality, we don't see a decline in the demand for transport. And obviously some of this would also involve cultural change. So for example, are people willing to give up their holidays to fly abroad? Are you happy to car share when you travel around? So if we want to have the impact that we need, it's the part in red here, the improve lever. And there's two elements to this. So one is we can improve the energy efficiency of vehicles. And secondly, we need to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels. So from my perspective, it's really the technology driven, as well as maybe some behavioural change that's important. Okay, so we now have a few slides looking at government policy. So what does the government think about all of this? So this slide shows the UK Transport Decarbonisation Plan. Now, the first thing to strike, if you're not familiar, is this is quite high level. It's a little bit fuzzy, but I'll highlight a couple of points I think relevant to hydrogen in particular. So if you look at point 3 on here, this is about how do we decarbonise freight. So as an example, maybe reducing the use of lorries, shifting to rail, maybe domestic shipping, but obviously in a greener way. And I think number 6 is really important. So when we look at aviation and shipping, clearly these are global. We need a global consensus in terms of how we green these sectors, because planes and ships refuel around the world. So we need a sort of collaboration around that. Okay, next. So this slide shows the UK government targets for decarbonising transport. So the parts in red are the targets around road. So these are very clear, and there's actually been a lot in the press about them recently. So particularly by 2030, we're supposed to end the sale of all basically petrol and diesel cars and vans. So people would need hybrid or battery electric vehicles. And there's some controversy around whether that's achievable. But for the other transport modes, so we're talking rail, aviation, shipping, the decarbonisation path is less clear. And that's one of the reasons we're here today, to get our views on it. Now, the government's offering different funding mechanisms, particularly around battery electric vehicles to help this transition. But what we really need is long-term planning for this transition, whether it's how we refuel, how we transport the fuels we're using. So we need a little more certainty happening over the decades. So this slide shows the UK government's hydrogen strategy, which covers all sectors or different sectors. So I've highlighted in red the parts that are relevant to transport. So the key points are that this is a phased approach, so it builds up over time. So first of all, we'll start with small scale hydrogen projects, then larger scale clusters and build up. Within transport, the different modes are on different timelines. So you'll see that for modes such as shipping and aviation, their sort of hydrogen journey really happens later. They're on a longer timeline. This strategy also very importantly includes how the hydrogen will be produced, transported and stored, because they're key elements of this sort of hydrogen revolution. Okay, so we've seen there's a lot of uncertainty around how the transport sector will decarbonise. The main energy source today are fossil fuels, so basically petrol and diesel. So to get to net zero, we need to shift to low carbon fuels and more energy efficiency. But how do we do that? Now, there's lots of different options, there's different fuels out there, particularly, as we'll see later, for shipping and aviation. And different fuels have different pros and cons. So some of the factors we look at are things like the cost, the safety, the speed of refueling is important. So that comes up even with electric vehicles, and obviously the environmental impact. So our question today is, to what extent is hydrogen part of the solution to solve this problem? So Francesca then will be talking about what is BIP's view on hydrogen, based on our analysis. Before I hand over to Francesca, are there any questions or anything, Helen?
No, there's nothing in the chat.
Okay. Okay. All right then, Francesca, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Isabel. So to understand the role of hydrogen in the decarbonization process of the transport sector, we took different drivers into considerations. First, we estimated the future demand for transport based on existing demand, general economic trends, such as GDP and demographics, and modal trends, such as the increase in public transport usage or the new normal working habits after the pandemic. Then we considered four main factors impacting how the transport demand translates into energy demand and which role can have each fuel in 2050. The adoption of the different fuel options depends on specific features of the technology from one side, so such as the technology readiness and the total cost of ownership, but also on enabling factors, policies that can incentivize or put mandatory requirements, and availability of energy sources and needed infrastructure. A first result of our analysis that we can see in the next slide is how the energy demand from transport will change over time. While transport usage will increase, overall energy demand is expected to almost halve due to electrification and the associated higher energy efficiency. This increase in efficiency is particularly relevant for road transport, which today accounts for nearly 70% of the energy demand, and in 2050 will drop to 51%. But why do we have this role of electricity in the transport sector? We can see it in the next slide, please. As I was mentioning before, when speaking about drivers impacting the adoption of different technologies, the competitiveness of each fuel has a significant impact on the conditions and timing of market penetration. Here you can see our estimate of different tipping points of hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels compared to the incumbent fossil fuel and to the main sustainable alternatives. With tipping point, we mean the time when the specific option will reach cost parity with the alternative and then may become convenient from an economic point of view. Road transport will be the first sector to switch to sustainable options, as we can already see from the increase in the number of electric vehicles sold. In particular, we can see that the hydrogen options will reach competitiveness later than the battery electric vehicles ones, apart from some use cases, in particular long-haul buses and trucks. This trend is confirmed also by the development plans of vehicle manufacturers. If we consider aviation, we know that the adoption of sustainable aviation fuel will be driven by mandates, blended with fossil jet fuels already during this decade. We expect biofuel to come first, and then a progressive switch to synfuel that will change the amount of hydrogen required over time. Pure hydrogen solution will only be feasible for short haul and in the late 40s. Shipping, like aviation, will be one of the latest sectors to see a viable, sustainable option, and the most competitive choices will be methanol and ammonia. Next slide, please. Given the tipping points and the other not less important drivers that I mentioned before, we derived our estimate of penetration of hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels, which you can see here in this slide, in the different sectors in 2050. Pure hydrogen will have a relevant role in long-haul heavy trucks and buses, reaching nearly 1/4 of the energy demand. Ammonia methanol will have a significant share of shipping, while SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, could reach over 20% of the energy demand from aviation. As a comprehensive result, we can see in the next slide how the demand for hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels will have a consistent share in 2050, surpassing 25% of the energy demand for transport, while electricity will have the main share with 45% of the demand. The role of hydrogen in the transport sector will be visible starting from 2030 and significant beyond 2040, as we can see better in the next slide. Our estimated demand for hydrogen for the transport sector in the UK in 2050 amounts to 79 terawatt hours, including the hydrogen required to produce hydrogen-derived fuels. As I was saying before, the demand will start to be relevant in 2040, when it will amount to 36 terawatt hours from our estimates, and then will double during the following decade. I would like to highlight here the role of hydrogen-derived fuels. The demand for hydrogen for synfuel, ammonia, and methanol will be more than the one for pure hydrogen. And this is important, especially for the infrastructural impact of these choices. To understand better the impact of hydrogen demand on infrastructure and what is needed from this point of view, it's necessary to put the regional perspective in the picture. I will then give the word to Giulio and Helen to address this section of our webinar. But first, is there any questions related to this section?
In the chat, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Giulio.
Thank you, Francesca. So now let's have a look at the infrastructural needs. So in terms of the location of hydrogen demand for transport, it will largely depend on the present and future transport infrastructure. If we look at the airport infrastructure, it is mostly right now located in and around London, with some smaller hubs near Bristol, Manchester, Birmingham, and Scotland. In terms of the port infrastructure, it is mainly located in the southeast, London, northwest, and Yorkshire and Humber regions, while the rail infrastructure in the UK is one of the lowest in terms of electrification in the EU, so in Europe, with only a large share of electrification in the southeast region, London region, with connections to Liverpool and Manchester and Glasgow and Edinburgh. And this means that given that the rest of the network is not electrified, this poses a lot of opportunity, not only for hydrogen penetration, but also for electrification. Moving on. So now let's understand the distribution of hydrogen demand across the UK within the different regions. So it's clear that some regions will have higher demand for hydrogen than others. For example, London, Southeast Scotland, East of England, Northwest, and Yorkshire and Humber will be the ones with the largest demand for hydrogen. And if we look at specific modes, so for example, in terms of aviation, London will be the region with the highest demand for hydrogen. If we look at the shipping sector, the largest region will be the southeast, with 5.3 terawatt hour of hydrogen demand. And if we look at the rail sector, our estimate is that the East of England will be the largest in terms of demand for hydrogen, with 0.3 terawatt hour, and also the largest in terms of the demand for road transport, with 2.3 terawatt hours in 2050. So let's move on to the next slide. So here what we can see is the different hydrogen supply and demand balances across the UK. So on the y-axis, we've plotted the demand for hydrogen estimate for each region that you've seen in the previous analysis, while on the x-axis, we've plotted the potential supply for hydrogen in each of those regions in terms of the production projects, initiatives, and hydrogen hubs that will be located within those regions. So when a region is positioned in the high equilibrium box of the matrix, it means that it has both a high demand and a high supply of hydrogen. Hence, the vast majority of the hydrogen produced within those regions will be used directly by the off-takers inside that region. So the need to transport hydrogen from and to those regions will be limited. However, the regions that have been placed in the low equilibrium box are the ones that have a low demand and low supply of hydrogen. So they're not as interesting in terms of transporting hydrogen from or to them. And then we can see that we've identified that there are some hydrogen importers, so some regions that have a really high demand for hydrogen, but that currently do not have a lot of existing or planned production initiatives for hydrogen. So there will be a need to import hydrogen to those locations. And then finally, we also understood that there are some exporter regions, for example, the southeast, Scotland, and east of England, where even though in some of them demand is high, supply will be even higher, which means that there will be a surplus of hydrogen in those regions, which can then be exported both at a national level, so towards other UK regions such as East Midland and London, which will require that hydrogen from other regions, but also at an international level, so outside of the UK. So in general, what we can say is that given the presence of these very interesting exporting regions, in general, the UK is forecasted to become a net exporter of hydrogen in the future. Now let me leave the floor to Helen from National Gas, who will explain next slide.
Thanks, Julia. So this slide showcases the work we're doing in national gas transmission to enable the transportation of hydrogen around the UK. And Project Union works to repurpose approximately 2,000 kilometres of our existing national transmission system in order to enable it to carry hydrogen by the early 2030s. This is going to be done as a phased approach in line with the UK government's cluster prioritisation work, and will connect supply, demand and strategic sites across the country to enable the growth of a UK hydrogen economy. The use of existing infrastructure will allow us to deliver this aim and deliver our sustainability goals whilst reducing the environmental impact of new construction. And it will also allow the decarbonisation of other sectors such as power, industry and transport. Thank you, and back to Julia.
You can move on to the next slide. Yes, so in general, in order to reach hydrogen penetration at scale, all of the industry stakeholders within the transport sector will need to make significant investments in the development of large and complex infrastructures, specifically regarding storage and refueling facilities. When we talk about the road sector, the infrastructural development will be mainly focused around existing fueling stations. The density of the refueling stations is a key driver of hydrogen adoption in the road sector, with existing sites that will have an imperative need to invest in storage tanks to guarantee volume flexibility. And in the long term, also pipelines are going to need to be built to transport the fuel from the production site to the refueling stations. While in the short and medium term, we can expect most of the hydrogen fuel transport to be performed via truck instead of via pipeline. In the aviation sector, sustainable aviation fuels, so SAF, will not require any major infrastructural investment with respect to the current status quo due to their drop-in nature. However, the progressive adoption of liquefied hydrogen will impose great infrastructural challenges to the industry stakeholders. Now, we see that it is likely that in the mature stages of the hydrogen economy, infrastructure at the airport level will include both liquefaction and storage facilities, while the electrolysis and power generation will be located at designated hydrogen production hubs due to the higher energy and spatial requirement of such infrastructures. And in the shipping sector, we see that LNG will not require any major infrastructural investment. However, hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives, such as ammonia, will require specific infrastructures in place to transport the fuel from the exporting to the importing port location. Now, among the different alternatives, it seems like the ammonia synthesis at the export terminal and ammonia cracking at the import terminal will be the most used carrier of hydrogen demand in the shipping sector. But they will still be competing with methanol in the long term. And this is due to the lower energy density of ammonia compared to hydrogen, and also its possibility to be used directly as a fuel or feedstock, and also the fact that ammonia is already being used and handled in the industry sector. We can move on to the conclusions.
We've got a couple of questions come through, if you don't mind me jumping in first.
Sure.
The first one goes back to Francesca's section. First, if you don't mind, Francesca. The question is, do the projections that you've presented include the energy demand to power EV charging points, such as hydrogen contributing to the national grid?
The short answer is no. The projections we showed do not include the hydrogen that may be required to balance, let me say, or to contribute to the electricity system in general. But when Giulio was talking about the import-export and so on in terms of the role of the different regions, in that case, we actually estimate the demand from a general perspective. So not only from a transport perspective, but from a general perspective. And in that case, we have included also the energy sector as well, the electricity sector as well. We decided not to include in the 79 terawatt hours that I've showed before, because the choices or the assumptions we should have made to make also this kind of estimate. I mean, the part of hydrogen required to power the system is something that it's not completely dependent on transport. It's not completely dependent on the topic we were addressing during the study.
Thank you. And there's one for Giulio as well, which is about the UK becoming a net exporter of hydrogen. Do you see that being low carbon or green hydrogen?
I think it's hard to say that definitely both will be employed.
Do we want to explain? Not everyone might know what those terms mean. Green hydrogen. Should we just, is it worth elaborating for people?
Yeah, so green hydrogen is hydrogen which comes from renewable energy. So the electrolysis process is powered by renewable energy.
Do we see, the net exportation? Do we see the fact that the UK is going to be a net exporter of hydrogen by your research? Is that going to be green hydrogen? That's the question.
Yes.
Or will that be a mixture of the green?
Also green and blue.
Okay, that's it from a question perspective. So if you want to jump on to the next section.
Yes. So in terms of let's close that bit of a summary of everything that was said in the session. So in terms of the road transport, we can see that it will be mainly dominated by battery electric vehicles, with a not negligible share of hydrogen, which is expected for heavy goods vehicles and buses, especially for long-haul applications of those vehicles. So where battery electric vehicles have constraints in terms of range. Biofuels will have only a transitory and limited role, while e-fuels will not be used in the road sector. In terms of rail, rail will be mainly electrified, with only a small penetration of hydrogen happening on the routes that will not allow electrification, so rural and low frequency routes. And in aviation, we see that sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, will be key to decarbonizing aviation. First, biofuel will be used due to the lower costs associated with it, but limits to the long-term sourcing of biofuel will favor syn fuel in the future, so in the long term. And hydrogen will only play a key role in the very long term. So we see that aviation will be one of those hard-to-abate sectors in which oil and fossil fuel will remain present also in the long term. In terms of shipping future is very uncertain, with LNG having a transitory role, but methanol and ammonia, as I mentioned before, will compete in the future to gain the larger share of the energy demand if economies of scale are achieved in renewable energy. And pure hydrogen will not be technically feasible due to problems related to the lower energy density of pure hydrogen. So moving on. So to wrap up the section, the transport sector is currently reliant on oil-derived fuels. However, alternative technologies are generally more expensive than traditional fuels. In the UK hydrogen strategy, the government has identified hydrogen as being fundamental to achieving net zero in 2050 in the transport industry. What we've assessed is that final energy demand in the UK transport sector will fall, despite an increase in the kilometers traveled. But this is due, as Francesca was mentioning, due to the energy efficiency linked to the electrification of road vehicles mostly. In terms of the hydrogen share of the demand, we've seen that it will reach approximately 79 terawatt hour in 2050, but electricity and battery electric vehicles will hold the main share of the sustainable options. However, whilst electricity appears already as the preferred choice for road transport, the better option for other transportation segments could be either pure hydrogen or hydrogen-derived fuels, as we've seen in the presentation. And it is key to remind that investment in infrastructure is critical as an enabler of the energy transition, with hydrogen refueling stations, pipelines, and storage facilities as being essential to the UK being able to transition the transport sector to a more sustainable economy.
Right, thank you, Giulio. So I think before we close out, we'd just like to get your views with a few more questions. If you'd like to take part, that would be great. So it's the same Mentimeter some of you used before. If you join later, if you look back in the Teams chat, you'll find the Mentimeter details also on this screen. Okay, so the first question. have your views on the potential for hydrogen in transport been influenced by what you have heard today? Let's wait a few more minutes, see if anyone else wants to answer. Okay, so for those who answered yes, do share in the chat, anything you found particularly interesting today or things you weren't aware of that maybe changed your views, or maybe you didn't know that much about this area before. And anyone that's put, not sure, if there's anything else you would like to know, any gaps, do post those questions and we'll try and respond as well. So, is there any additional information or insights you think you need to know before having a clearer view? Okay, last question. So this last question relates to what Helen presented. So would it be helpful for the transport sector to repurpose the national transmission system pipelines to transport hydrogen instead of gas? Do you think that's a good idea or not? To what extent? This is obviously a scale, so you can choose your point on the scale. Okay, so I think it's stabilized. So I think we're ending up at probably 2/3 along. So I think that's probably on the scale probably useful, but not essential. So there's obviously a range of answers there. So particularly those who probably see it more on the left-hand side, we're really keen to understand your views. We'll provide contact details shortly, actually, but I think particularly Helen will be interested to know, if you see any challenges around this idea, we're keen to understand why. Okay, so we go back to the slides. So before I close out, any other questions? Anything else to respond to?
I know there's nothing in the chat at the minute,
Okay.
but yes, just to echo what you said, Isabel, my contact details are there on the slide, and yes, I'd be keen to have a conversation with anybody who's interested in doing that outside of this webinar.
Right, thanks, Helen. Yes, so please do reach out either to myself or to Helen if you have any questions or comments, if you'd like further discussion. Also, we're conscious this holiday season, so if there's other people in your organisations who you think would like to be involved in this conversation, please also pass on their contact details. So as mentioned at the beginning, we will email you shortly with a copy of our report, a link to the recording, and some question and answers. So it just remains me to say thank you very much for joining. Really appreciate you joining us today. And I think we'll end it there.